In the days that quickly followed the first declaration of war, as country after country mobilized and marched, the news that mattered most was the news of Europe and its spreading battlefronts. It was America's foreign-born who first felt the impact of the war in Europe, and they tried as best they could to explain it to their American friends. To them, war was a sad, familiar old world story, the age-old blight upon the lands from which they came.
Anna, Weiskirchen, look, right here in the paper.
This is the end of history.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies.
We believe that peace is at hand.
An axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world.
Democracy and freedom for all. We must choose in this crucial moment of human history.
Years ago, when I first began to study international relations, I read the book Paris, 1919. That's by Margaret Macmillan. That was one of those life-altering books when it came to my understanding of the world, of world history. We easily get caught up in presuming the world we currently inhabit, it's the world that always was. Now, I know we discount that at a logical, even a rational level. We know there was a history that got us here, that things were different in the past, but now it feels bigger, more permanent than it really is. Macmillan's book, 1919, Paris 1919, it opened my eyes for the first time, not the last time, but to how young our modern history, our modern world really is. Ideas like nations, human rights, these were all legitimized in 1919 at the peace conference that followed World War I, the war to end all wars. And even at that point, there was a lot of upgrading that had to follow. If you look at a world map from this period, around 1919, you find it looks totally different from what was drawn up after that year, after that peace conference. The map of Africa was not a map of lines and or was now a map of lines and borders after that time. Where you have nations on that map today, in 1919, before then, you had regions and zones that colonial powers ruled over. To a large extent, it's the same in the Middle East. Even when we look at the formation, the creation of the modern Middle East, we've got to start at 1919, at the end of World War I. And when I say creation, I mean exactly that. In many ways, the decisions, the actions that occurred at the peace conference in 1919, there in Paris, they involved creating these national entities, these borders that we take for granted in the modern Middle East today, and then imposing those same borders upon the lands, upon the peoples of that area of the world without their consent, without their agreement. And meaning even most instances, the construct of the modern Middle East that the great powers formulated in 1919 was a completely artificial formula. And that the people, the cultures of the Middle East, had little, if any, say in when it came to the decisions made there. So as a result, the seeds of many, if not most, of the problems of the Middle East today, they were actually sown in the decisions of 1919. So over the next century, those seeds began to grow, began to blossom. And that's what's produced the chaos and the tumult that we know today. But we got to go back just a little bit before we jump into 1919. We have to see who the decision makers were at the Paris Peace Conference, those tables there at that conference that followed World War I. These were men, mostly European, who came of age in the era of European dominance. Most of them were born in the middle of the 19th century. This was the heyday of European nationalism. Nations like France and Britain, Belgium, they advanced across the globe like never before in history in that century. Philosophies and worldviews like Darwinism, even Christianity, supported and justified the advance in the minds of these white men from Europe. They came to see the world through a survival of the fittest, a might makes right sort of framework. They were at the apex of the Industrial Revolution, and so their military, their economic strength allowed them to simply run over other cultures, other lands, from East Asia all the way to Africa, the Pacific, and of course even in the Middle East, because they were so strong relative to the underdeveloped world that had not yet industrialized in the 19th century. These Europeans came to see themselves as even called by God and on a mission of destiny. Rudyard Kipling, the great poet and writer from Britain during this time, he wrote about the white man's burden to bring civilization to the savages of the world. Now, Rudyard Kipling was no Christian, but he still imagined a divine destiny to bring the gifts of white European civilizations to the savage races of the world. That's what he called it. That's what he called them, those other races, savages.
Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Oh, take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple, 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. Take up the white man's burden, the savage war of peace. Fill full the mouth of famine and bid the sickness cease. And when your goal is nearest, the end for others sought, watch sloth and heathen folly bring all your hope to naught. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things.
And of course, savage meant darker races, because everywhere the Europeans looked, they saw white races as strong and darker races as weak. So their philosophies and even their theologies began to evolve around that perspective. If you look at ancient history, you don't find people writing about white or black people. That came about in the 18th and 19th centuries when Europeans began categorizing and classifying the races. And in that classifying, they designed power structures. The white Christian Europeans endured brutal and bloody warfare among themselves for centuries, but by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, early in the 19th century, a lot of that came to an end. They developed a balance of power in Europe so that they didn't fight each other as much. That balance of power was only interrupted occasionally. That didn't mean they had peace. They just stopped fighting their neighbors and started taking their armies and their navies to other lands. And that's where the colonial empires were born. The race for Africa was launched. The powers of Europe found their industrialized armies and navies could easily conquer lands and people that relied on spears and clubs and bows and arrows. It was the same in East Asia, and to some extent it was the same in the Middle East. America liked to envision itself as exempt from all this colonialism, all this arrogance. They weren't. They did the same thing. In North America, they envisioned a manifest destiny to conquer the continent and dominate the Native Americans there. Americans branched out at times into South America and even into the Pacific Islands. In fact, when Rudyard Kipling talked about the white man's burden, he was specifically talking to the American people, challenging them to take up the white man's burden and tame the so-called savages of the Pacific. That was what the context of that poem was all about when he wrote it. This was Europe. This was the West at the dawn of World War I. Incredibly arrogant. Ideas strongly rooted to race. Industrialized power bases justified a lot in their eyes. And even amid arrogant and racist worldviews, they thought they were actually extending mercy and grace to the backward civilizations of the earth. Now, when it came to the Middle East, they were kind of stuck in the middle of all of this. Before the rise of Europe's Industrial Revolution, world power was actually based in the Middle East. The Ottoman Empire, that was the largest empire in history up to that point. It spread across the Middle East, Central Asia, reached all the way to North Africa. At its zenith, the Ottomans reached the gates of Southern Europe, a Muslim powerhouse empire that constantly threatened the kingdoms of Europe before the shift in global power that took shape in the 19th century. That conflict between Christian Europe before the Enlightenment and the Muslim Ottoman Empire, that was a cultural definer during those centuries before the 19th century. When you look at stories, for example, of like Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, the background of that story is a conflict between the lands of Christian-ruled Romania and the encroaching threat of the Ottomans. So there's a lot of stories, a lot of anecdotes like this. Europe came into its own during the 19th century after centuries of fearing the threat not only of the Ottomans, but the Muslims, who they saw as barbarous, brutal. Meanwhile, the Ottomans saw the Europeans as backward, as uncivilized. The Ottoman Empire was the center of the world where science, algebra, geography, even philosophy thrived until it didn't. By the 19th century, as Europe ascended in power, fueled by its industrialization, by colonial expansion, the Ottoman Empire was on the decline at that time. And a big reason for that was just the trend of empires. The Ottoman rulers, they became set in their ways. They didn't change with the times. That facilitated corruption, and then it slowly but surely began to disintegrate from the outer edges of the empire and work its way inward. The Europeans, bent on conquering and controlling the world with their new power, were only too happy to take advantage of the Ottoman Empire's decline. So by the end of the 19th century, the great powers of Europe, they commonly referred to the Ottoman Empire, based out of Turkey, they referred to it as the sick man of Europe. It was just a matter of time before it collapsed, and the great powers planned to pounce on it once that occurred. In 1908, signs of that collapse were more apparent than ever. After failing to reform the empire, failing to do it fast enough, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire fell to what became known as the Young Turk Revolution. Now, the Young Turks promised to modernize the Ottoman Empire, but all they really did was help guide it in for the inevitable collapse that occurred in World War I. And by the end of that war, the Ottoman Empire was gone. And that's when the modern Middle East was born. Now, to understand how World War I ended up reshaping the Middle East, we have to understand how enormous, how overwhelming, and frankly just how devastating that great war was. This is one of the most fascinating topics of history, in my opinion. Most of my studies, most of my podcasts have to do with people and places when it comes to history. But if I was to pick one era to study, it would probably be World War I. Everything changed during World War I. The old age of Europe died. A new age began to emerge. It was the death of one world order and the birth of a new world order. And all of that was still just a prelude to what was to come in World War II. When the war broke out, World War I, the powers of Europe, they expected it to last just a few months, at best. Remember, this is coming after a century of almost no conflict between the Europeans. There was the Crimean War in 1853, but beyond that, most of the fighting that the Europeans had done over the last century took place in other parts of the world where they easily mastered. They easily dominated tribes and kingdoms who had much less sophisticated weaponry, much less sophisticated arms. So in a weird way, all the great powers of Europe went blindly charging into this fight and assumed at World War I that they would just run over their enemies just like they'd been doing for the last century to everyone else. But not this time. The armies of Europe collided in the middle of the continent into an orgy of violence that disintegrated into trench warfare. In recent years, we've remembered the 100-year anniversary of World War I with movies like 1917, All Quiet on the Western Front, things like that. Those perspectives have served to educate us a bit to the reality of this devastating experience. You had generals riding out to fight in battles atop horses, carrying huge swords with this war, and they were met by tanks. The first armed airplanes, chemical weapons, artillery unlike anything experienced in the past. And the powers of Europe ran into the war, well, they barely made it out alive by the end of it. I mentioned the Crimean War way back in 1853. Around 500,000 people died in that fight. In World War I, 9 million soldiers died. Add to that another 5 million civilians. Hidden within the fighting, you had genocides, massacres, pandemics. It was difficult simply to keep track of all the death and dying. Just for the sake of scale, during the American Civil War 50 years earlier, Antietam was one of the deadliest battles of that war. All right? It was called the most terrible battle of the age at that time. Nearly 22,000 people died at Antietam, this bloody battle. During World War I, you've got numerous battles where hundreds of thousands died. That's in a single battle. At the Battle of the Somme alone, there were more than 1.2 million casualties at that fight, at that battle. This is what it looked like for the world and for the world order to fall apart. I did a podcast several years ago about this period, and many believed during this time that it was the end of the world. For those living in the middle of all the chaos and carnage, that must have been what it felt like. Death was mounting on every front. None of the European powers could stop it, any more than they could control it. Even those who survived the war, they came back traumatized. This is where they coined phrases like shell-shocked. It's what we call PTSD today. Men and women who survived the fighting still came back different, often leaving parts of their minds, souls, even their bodies on those deadly battlefields. And before long, the question had to be asked, what's all this for? If you're losing loved ones in the fight, that had to be the question. That had to be asked. Why? What was the purpose of it all? Was it just for power, just part of the great game among the great powers? For the leaders of Europe, many of them began to look at the Ottoman Empire. This would be the reward, they thought. This would be what they would walk away from this deadly fight with when it finally all ended. They would take the spoils of war from the sick man of Europe. And by this time, the Young Turks Revolution had dwindled down to an elite group of rulers over the stumbling empire. These men they proved as corrupt as they were incompetent, to be frankly honest. As the war broke out, it seemed that Germany was set to win. So that certainly played into the Ottoman decision to side with Germany at that time. There was also a lot of historical tension, a lot of historical threats from Russia and the north of the Ottoman Empire. So once the Allied powers like France and Britain made their alliance with Russia during World War I, well, that also played into pushing the Ottomans over to the German side of the fighting. And so the stage was set early on as World War I commenced. The Central Powers, which included Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans, versus the Triple Entente, or the Allies, France, Britain, and Russia. Now, if you've done any amount of research or listened to other podcasts about the Middle East during World War I, then you probably heard of the Sykes-Picot Agreement. The Europeans didn't have a lot of experts on the Middle East as they went into this war. They had experts in India who generally tried to interpret and navigate Middle East policy to best suit British policies there in India. When the European armies began entering the Middle East, they often realized that even their maps were wrong when they got there. That caused more than one military debacle in the Middle East during the Great War. For the most part, you had people within the British and French government who had a lot of imaginations about the Middle East. They romanticized it. This will play a big part, a big role, a big deal in our story as we go along. One of those men who romanticized the Middle East was Mark Sykes. Absent any other leading experts, he made his way into the pivotal decisions of Britain and the future of the Middle East by simply volunteering. Growing up, his parents lived separated from one another, and he often traveled with his father into the Ottoman Empire. So based on that knowledge alone, he offered himself to the British Empire when war broke out and eventually became the Middle East advisor to the British War Cabinet. For the French, Georges Picot was a lawyer, a diplomat who spent most of his career in China. Just before the war began, he was dispatched to Lebanon. Now, these two men, Picot and Sykes, definitely not experts on the Middle East by any measure. They managed to get their names recorded in history with the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Signed in 1916, and in the middle of the war, the Sykes-Picot Agreement was basically a decision among the Allies, Britain, France, and Russia, of who would get what lands in the inevitable dismembering of the Ottoman Empire. It was a secret agreement, never intended to be made public. For the British, their priority was to have a land route from the Mediterranean all the way to India. So that meant a great bulk of land, including Palestine, Iraq, and Iran. These were all names we call them by today, of course, not at that time. but that would go to the British. The French had been actively involved in the area known as the Levant, modern-day Lebanon and Syria, for nearly a century. So they planned to maintain their ties there in those lands. These kinds of agreements, these secret agreements, littered the policies, the decisions of the great powers during World War I. Men without knowledge of the situation on the ground in the Middle East, contributing to significant claims, significant discussions whose real objectives were in the interest of the great powers, not the people of the Middle East. So you had a recipe for disaster right from the start. Rather than understanding the people, rather than understanding the cultures of the Middle East, European policymakers used their imaginations to fashion what would become ultimately the modern Middle East. And just as vested as their imagination was in their decisions, so was the overarching priority of their own nation's national interest. Well, for their part, the British tried to build alliances with different Arab leaders within the Middle East. But even that effort was corrupted. Again, way too much imagination on the part of the Europeans went into agreements that the British made with various Arab rulers. For example, the British, they often spoke about, they looked for ways to sway the opinion of the Muslims of the Middle East. They thought if they could recruit to their side the spiritual ruler of the Muslims in the Middle East, then all the people who followed that religion in those lands would follow them. Well, the problem was that's not the way Islam works. There is no pope in Islam, no central ruler or figurehead. There's local figureheads, local power brokers, but nothing like what the British imagined. Well, that didn't keep the many players on the Arab side of things from pretending they could deliver the whole Arab and Muslim world over to the side of the British and other Europeans. The Hashemites, they ruled over the Hijaz region of Arabia. They dominated the city of Mecca. This family, the Husseins, they saw a golden opportunity with the outbreak of the war and the decline of the Ottomans. They went over to the side of the British and they promised they could lead an Arab revolt across the Middle East that would upend the Ottoman Empire there. Now, it didn't hurt that Hussein bin Ali, his third son, Feisal, well, he looked every bit the romantic Arab prince that the British had imagined. T.E. Lawrence, the guy who would become known as Lawrence of Arabia, he became a champion of the Husseins, particularly Feisal Hussein.
For over a quarter of a century, controversy has raged around the name of T.E. Lawrence. No man of our time has drawn upon himself so much praise and so much criticism. Lawrence of Arabia, the man torn between two civilizations. Lawrence of Arabia, filmed against a canvas of awesome magnificence.
Lawrence was a British scholar who specialized in the antiquity of the Crusades before World War I. In his mid-20s, when the war broke out, he became a fast-rising star, a specialist in the British forces of the Middle East. He and Feisal became very close. They became friends, and they became major players in the peace conference of 1919 after the war. The great Arab revolt of World War I that the Hashemite clan promised never really materialized. They won some fights, some battles to be sure, but it was nowhere near as big as the British had hoped and as the Husseins had promised. Another Arab player was King Abdul Aziz. Abdul Aziz was a powerful Bedouin warrior in southern Arabia. He fought for power, for territory for years against the Ottomans. He was part of a Puritan sect of Islam known as Wahhabism. Now, the Wahhabis focused on spiritual purity, and they would have that. This is stuff that would have fit the ideals of what we know as ISIS today, minus a little bit of the crazy, just a little. But they were this super strict sect on Islamic law. They opposed anything and everything that violated the code of Islam. And King Abdulaziz was, him and his Ikhwan, the brotherhood of Wahhabi Bedouin, these warriors, was a consistent nuisance and rebel to the Ottomans during the pre-war years throughout Arabia. Well, King Abdulaziz, for his part, was willing to ally with either the Ottomans or the British, whoever would gain him the most power by the end of the war. Militarily, he was more effective than the Hashemites. Whenever the British gave him a task to do, he seemed to get it done. And while he was just as ambitious, King Abdulaziz, his real strength was more in the south towards Arabia, no small thing, particularly for the British Navy along the coastline of Arabia. Then there was a third player among the Arabs, a figure whom the author David Fromkin identifies as this mysterious figure of whom hardly anything is known. His name was Muhammad Sharif al-Faruqi. Now, Faruqi was a member of a secret society within the Ottoman Empire as it crumbled. These secret societies, they definitely existed. They were different variations of nationalist groups set up with either hopes of or ambitions to overthrow the Sultan or the Young Turks when given the opportunity. But existing and being effective, those are really two different things. Faruqi was a member of the Ottoman army, and he came over to the British side in 1915. He greatly oversold the idea of a great Arab revolt. He let the Allies know that secret societies of Arab nationalists were spread throughout the Ottoman Empire, and if they didn't side with the Arabs quickly, then they could lose out on all those alliances. So it was Faruqi, as much as anyone else, who helped push the British into the camps of supporting the Husseins, especially Feisal Hussein. The thing is, the secret societies were not well organized. They weren't really a force for the Allies during World War I. Faruqi, this man of mystery that helped pressure and influence the British toward the Arabs during the war, he actually died in 1920, even if his influence was still felt beyond that. Secret societies and secret organizations, a gallant, noble-looking Arab prince, a fearsome Bedouin warrior brotherhood. Those were the images that inspired the imagination of the British and other European policymakers in the Middle East during World War I. It wasn't about facts or expertise. It was imagination. It was myth. Ever since World War I, many groups from different sides of these entangled alliances have held up evidence of deception and broken promises. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, for example, showed the real European intent to split up the Middle East for themselves, to never really focus on Arab nationalism or self-rule like the Europeans had promised they would when they made alliances with these different groups. And that's definitely true. But those accusations, they also miss the point that all of these groups were lying to each other. The British and the French made different promises among themselves that they promised to other Arabs. But to the Arabs, they also oversold what they could deliver to the Europeans during the war. Even after the war, the posturing, the deal-making that went on behind closed doors knew no limit, as we'll see here in a moment. Everyone made promises on both sides they either couldn't or had no intent to actually keep. Everyone was looking out for their own interest. And of course, that brings us to another group with heavy interest in the Middle East, the Jewish people. Now, I go into more detail on this in my podcast series on the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Get that series downloaded to your phone today if you haven't already done so. You can get it at the website. If you want to dig in, get the 25-episode series for a deep dive on this one. For now, it's important to note that Zionism was an old focus of the Jewish people. The idea of returning to the Promised Land, the land of Palestine, it had been a dream since the fall of Jerusalem during the 1st century AD, when the Romans conquered it. But in the late 19th century, Zionism gained new steam. Zionism was really a minority position for the Jewish people, scattered throughout the world. In fact, by the 19th century, more Jewish people in places like Russia, they wanted to immigrate to the U.S. More of them wanted to go there rather than to Palestine, far more in fact. The Austro-Hungarian named Theodor Herzl, he helped stir the fires for Jewish nationalism at the end of the 19th century. It wasn't based out of religious fervor or a longing for Palestine. It was based out of the beliefs of nationalism, these beliefs that were spreading across Europe at that same time. Herzl and his new organization of Jewish nationalists, they weren't even totally focused on Palestine at first. At one time, they had thoughts of like Uganda as a possible new homeland for the Jews of Europe. There were other locations too. Eventually, though, seeing the sick man of Europe, the declining Ottoman Empire, and the potential for a homeland in Palestine began to make sense. And so before long, the Zionists turned their hopes almost full focus onto the lands of Palestine by World War I. Now, the problem was the Arabs already lived there, the Palestinians. They didn't have a big nationalist organization. They saw themselves as Ottomans, after all. Some of them saw themselves as Syrian, but they were there already. The Jewish people by World War I represented only 10% of the population of Palestine. Once again, though, the European imagination got the better of them. It got in the way of actual facts on the ground. Leading policymakers among the British especially, going all the way up to the Prime Minister, came of age on the Bible and the ideas of ancient Israel. Many of them were very devoted Christians with very bad theology. One of the common denominators we find about Christian Zionists during World War I, but really all the way to the present today, is that their theology is nearly as bad as their understanding of history. Different policymakers among the British, particularly among the British, they truly believed that if they were able to secure a homeland for the Jews and the lands of Palestine specifically, or the lands of ancient Israel, then that would trigger the return of Christ. A lot of people believe that even to this day among Christian Zionists. I guess everybody kind of overlooks the point. It's been done already, and it hasn't happened. That must not be the secret. That must not be the key. So we have this yet another promise made by the British to yet another group of people with eyes and interest on the Middle East. In 1917, the Foreign Secretary of Britain, James Balfour, he issued his famous Balfour Declaration. If you're familiar with the history of modern Israel, then you know what this is about. It was a written letter, only 3 sentences long, written by Balfour to Lord Rothschild. He was a leading figurehead within the Jewish Zionist community of Britain. And I'm just going to read the whole letter to you. It says, "Dear Lord Rothschild, I have much pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the Cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation." Pretty simple, right? And yet enormously consequential to what would follow in the Middle East. Interestingly, there was also a lot of anti-Semitic thought that went into the efforts to move the British towards siding with these Zionist goals in the Middle East. More than a few British military, British political policy makers, they believed that by supporting the Zionist movement in Palestine, they would recruit the Jews of the world to their side of the war and thus ensure victory over the Germans and the Ottomans, because many of these guys believed in a secret cabal of Jews who ran the world. Now, this didn't materialize too much, but one thing that did happen is that because the Jewish people of the Zionist organization were so much better entrenched within Europe and American society before the war broke out, they had a decidedly greater advantage over the competing Arab interest in the Middle East, and specifically in the land known as Palestine by the time of the 1990 or 1919 peace conference. And that, of course, brings us back to the part the Americans played in the war. At first, America really had no interest in participating in World War I. Public opinion, most of the politicians themselves at that time, they were against it. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, he even ran for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." For the Americans, World War I represented everything wrong with foreign entanglements. It was a move for power among the European states that resulted in calamity, and they imagined themselves to want nothing to do with it.
We are not here to discuss the rights and wrongs of the European war. We are here to help its innocent victims, little children, helpless and starving. The Committee for the Relief of Belgium, under the able chairmanship of Herbert Hoover, can feed a Belgian child for a month on a $5 bill.
Now, depending on where you sit on this, depending on your viewpoint, some people believe Woodrow Wilson was among America's greatest presidents. Others believe he's among the worst. There's rarely any middle ground on this. He was an academic, not a political insider. Wilson was a game-changer type of politician. When he came to power, when he was first elected in 1912, he went out of his way to make all sorts of changes to the American system. But following his re-election in 1916, he set his sights on the world. The Zimmermann telegram, that's a famous move by the Germans to try and recruit Mexican involvement into World War I. And the idea was that if Mexico would side with Germany, then following the war, Mexico would get back territory that the U.S. took from them during the 19th century. Now, the problem, of course, was that the Zimmermann telegram, meant to remain secret, was discovered. It was published in American newspapers. So before long, the tide of American public opinion quickly turned not only against Germany, but in favor of American entrance into that war. So Wilson, armed with public opinion on his side, in spite of the promises during his re-election campaign, he decides to go to war. But if America was going to go to war, Woodrow Wilson determined it would be a different kind of war. Wilson envisioned a war to end all wars type of fight if America was going to get involved. He, armed with American military might that the Allies desperately needed as they sat gridlocked in the trenches of Europe, he would upend the way Europe did warfare. In the study of international relations, there are two key schools of thought regarding how nations work. The first school of thought is based upon realism. It says that nations have interest and they always pursue their interest. The second school of thought is called idealism. Nations have ideals and they operate at their finest when they pursue those ideals. This school of thought is all about ideas, about philosophies, and perhaps no other president better epitomized this school of thought than Woodrow Wilson. The president went to work to sell his plans for American involvement in the war. He developed a platform. He called it the 14 points that would be necessary for America to send its troops into the fighting. Now, these points were radical departures from the normal way of fighting a war. Rather than countries going to war over new and more territories that was not even theirs to begin with, Wilson said this is going to have to stop. The old world way of doing business in the world, that had expired. And it was time for a new age, a modern age. The only reason that it would be worth the Americans going to war for, if this was a war to be fought, was if this was a war to be fought to end all wars. That's what Wilson was proposing. So Wilson's 14 points included the development of a League of Nations. That's the forerunner of what we know today as the United Nations, an international body that would allow for diplomacy and talks to stop the buildup of wars like these. He wanted nations to disarm, put their economies towards peace building and prosperity rather than unceasing warfare. One of the most revolutionary of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points was this call for self-determination. This was the idea that nations and peoples should be allowed to rule themselves rather than to be ruled by the great powers of Europe. Now, this was huge. More than any of the other 14 points, this call for self-rule lit a fire throughout the colonial world for hope, for promise among the people ruled by those great powers. From Africa to Asia to the Middle East, young nationalists flocked to the promise of self-rule as a visionary ideal from Wilson that would give the meaning for all this violence and brutality of that horrific world war that we would soon come to call World War I. It wasn't only in the colonized world. As millions of Europeans died in the war, the citizens of Europe, they themselves gravitated to Wilson's noble ideal of self-rule among the peoples of the earth. After nearly a century of Europe seeing colonialism as a noble endeavor and the white man's burden to bring civilization to the world, it now fell out of fashion in an instant. Wilson became a celebrity. He traveled across America. He traveled across Europe, pitching this idea of self-rule for the principles and the people of the world. The great sacrifices of the men who lost their lives, their strength, their minds on the battlefronts of Europe and the Middle East in this horrific fight, well, it would now serve a higher purpose. Wilson, more than anyone else, presented a reason, finally, for all this fighting. Now, to be sure, the leaders of the great powers in Europe weren't all for this. They resented Wilson's ideals. Surely they needed his troops and his armaments, but they saw him as this naive interloper who not only failed to understand how the world really worked, but he was going to upend everything they had established and agreed to amid the fighting. Someone had to pay for the war, and now Wilson, with his brave ideals, was canceling out the debt owed by whoever loses the war and forfeiting the spoils of war that the great powers thought they were about to gain. Not least among Wilson's 14 points was another high ideal. There would be no more secret agreements, Wilson said. This was the first of his 14 points, in fact. No more secret agreements. He was going to change the way the world worked. No more backroom deals. No more secret treaties and alliances. All of Europe knew these things happened. But now, if Wilson had his way, that would all come to an end. He was basically calling for more transparent democracy, globally, for the world. Well, as if on cue, in Russia, the Tsar's oppressive regime was overthrown in revolution just in time for Wilson's world tour with the 14 points. The Bolshevik Revolution shook all of Europe and eventually the world. It would set the stage for a new East versus West war for nearly the next century. But at that time, all that people really understood was that one of the great powers had fallen. The Bolsheviks promised to remove themselves from the fighting of World War I. In fact, Germany had actually helped Vladimir Lenin get back to Russia while he was living in exile to foment his revolution because they knew he would pull Russia out of the war, thus turning the balance of power in the fighting, at least for now, in their favor. That was their hope. That was the hope of Germany. Well, Lenin took Russia out of the war, but he also did a little more. Remember that secret agreement between the Russians, the French, and the British, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Lenin published it for all the world to see. Look, he said, this is what the capitalists, what the imperialist countries of the world are really fighting for. And he was actually right. These were secret agreements that the Allies had made to make the war worth fighting for in their eyes. It was all about an increase in power and territory for the Europeans. The timing on this was huge. Just as Lenin published the secret deal made by the great powers in regards to the Middle East, in comes President Woodrow Wilson saying, enough of that. Now it's time to retrain our focus and the way the world fights wars. It's not about secret agreements. It's not about territories anymore. It's about an end to all wars. The movers, the shakers of policy in Britain and France, they were just as irritated with Wilson as they were with Lenin, but he actually did them a favor. He muted the effects that Lenin's publication of Sykes-Picot might have had. And the tribes of the Middle East didn't turn against Britain. They didn't turn against France. Instead, they got distracted by Wilson. Self-rule, you say? I like that idea. Wilson did the same for all of Europe. As America entered the war and it wound down to its conclusion, Wilson had basically redeemed it in the eyes of so many people who had lost loved ones in the fighting. It was no longer about power, no longer about politics or imperialism or profits. It was about ending war once and for all. Of course, you've got to keep in mind, none of this actually worked. There's something to be said for failed hopes. The people of the world imagined a new world order where peace and democracy would reign. That's what Wilson sold. But within a generation, they're fighting again. Another world war, in fact. This all fails. And that failure is really significant for the people of the Middle East who saw their own hopes dashed, even betrayed, when we arrived in Paris in 1919 for the peace conference. As the Allies arrived at the Paris Peace Conference, there were, to say the least, a lot of conflicting motives. The French wanted Germany to pay. The British wanted to take as much territory as they could. The Americans, under Wilson, wanted a new world order. And then you have all these other parties who had been stirred by Wilson's 14 points to take up their cause for nationalism. The world converged on the City of Lights that year with great hopes, great expectations that they would find value out of what they had just endured in the Great War. A young nationalist from East Asia, he washed dishes in the restaurants of Paris by night in the hopes of meeting with Wilson and the great powers by day. He wanted to talk to Woodrow Wilson. He wanted to speak up for the cause of self-interest in his homeland. Well, he was never heard. He would eventually rise up as a revolutionary, a nationalist in French Indochina, and what the Americans would come to know as Vietnam. His name, by that time, was Ho Chi Minh. Egypt, too, sent a group of nationalists to Paris who spoke out for Egyptian independence from Britain and the great powers. These were the leading voices for Egyptian nationalism at that time. But again, the peace conference never heard them. Over and over again, this story repeated itself. The colonized world presented representatives to the peace conference, ready, willing to take on the burden of self-interest for their people, only to find that the great powers were not quite willing to let go of power in those lands. The Americans, represented in the person of Woodrow Wilson, they talked a big game, but they refused to back it up. Wilson himself would soon become sick, virtually incapacitated. After heading back to the U.S., he was president in name only. He died shortly after his final term in office, but even before that, incapacitated by a stroke, his political opponents undid everything he had hoped for the role the U.S. would play in the culmination of the Great War. The U.S. didn't even join or fully participate in the League of Nations that he envisioned, retreating into a position of isolationism until World War II was well underway 2 decades later. Areas of the Middle East that realized colonialism was not really over, as had been advertised. These are areas like Palestine and Syria. Well, they said they would accept a temporary rule from the Americans, the least proven of the colonial powers. But even that wasn't to be. With Wilson out of the way, the great powers, the representatives of those great powers, they went to work in Paris, carving up the New World, particularly the Middle East as they saw fit. A special commission, the Crane Commission, was appointed to investigate what should happen with Palestine. Keep in mind, Palestine represented a territory far greater than what most think of as either Palestine or Israel today. It included the lands of Jordan, even part of modern Syria. What that commission concluded was that despite the intentions of Britain's Balfour Declaration, Palestine was nowhere near ready for a Jewish state. The Jews of Palestine represented less than 10% of the population. The people of Palestine had no interest in a Jewish state. Many of them wanted to be Syrians, or maybe they wanted to be Ottomans, and not a few wanted their own nation, Palestine. So this new entity was developed at the Paris Peace Conference. It was called a mandate. The colonial powers would rule over territories, rule over nations, and although they looked suspiciously like colonies, they were now called mandates. And the idea was that the mandates were not yet ready for independence, not quite ready for self-rule. Therefore, for their own good, the great powers would rule over these mandates and help prepare them for independence and self-rule. Throughout the colonized world and the former Ottoman and Austro-Hungarian empires, new mandates were established, and the great powers were entrusted to rule over them. Incidentally, a trend was established. The mandates of the lands of darker races were seen as less prepared for independence and self-rule, while lighter-skinned races were seen as more ready. Such was the state of the New World after World War I. In Palestine, the British set up their own mandate, the Palestine Mandate. This would become a major headache for the British over the next 20 years. By the time of World War II, 20 years later, the British would be fed up and sick of the Palestine Mandate. They would find themselves stuck fighting a terror movement from the growing Jewish population in Palestine, doing what they could to actually work against the Jewish people there in Palestine at that time. That's all in the future, though. For now, at the end of World War I, the Palestine Mandate ruled over by the British represented a fulfillment, as far as they were concerned, of their promise to the Jewish people of the world. It also represented part of the fulfillment of British goals in the Middle East and the former Ottoman Empire. They wanted a land route from the Mediterranean to India. Palestine was their entry point, but it wasn't the end. By the time of all the post-war agreements were said and done, the British added 1 million square miles to their colonial empire after World War I. In Persia, the British worked with a young military leader by the name of Reza Shah to fight against the Bolshevik incursions into the oil fields of Iran. Oil was not a major commodity in the Middle East at this time. That would come later. What oil was identified was what was in Persia, or what we know as Iran today. So the British armed and allied with Reza Shah to oust the Bolsheviks. Shah would end up taking the last name of Pahlavi. And through a coup in the 1920s, he became the Shah of Iran, leader of the Pahlavi dynasty. And the Shah secured the interior of his new domains, whose name he changed to Iran by that time. With British assistance, he expelled political threats and foes. The Shah reigned for 16 years until World War II brought a renewed focus on that region by both the Soviets and the British. And once again, the British made the critical decision to interfere with Iranian politics and forced Reza Shah's abdication. His son took his place. The son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, would be the last Shah of Iran. Of course, we'll look more at that story in the next episode. For now, there were more promises to fulfill, more expectations to fail for the great powers at the peace conference in 1919. The British had already signed a treaty with Ibn Saud in 1915, recognizing him as the king of the Najd, the central part of what is today Saudi Arabia. Saud and his Ikhwan were easily the strongest of the Arab tribes at that time. Agreements were made between the British and the Hashemites too, which I'll get to in a minute, but a lot of their territory promised to them was actually conquered by Saud within a few years' time. Saud and his Wahhabis, pretty ruthless, violent in their conquest of Arabia. Equipped with British arms, Saud took most of southern Arabia and what we would call Saudi Arabia today. Throughout the 1920s, different treaties were established to recognize the boundaries of his advance, of Saud's advance. These included Palestine and Iraq in the north and west, and then the Gulf states in the south that represented key British interests as far as port areas were concerned. By 1932, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was officially established under the rulership of Ibn Saud. To the British, this was a backwater state of wastelands where the holy Muslim cities were based out of, but little else of value as far as they were concerned. They didn't know what was to come in the years ahead, that it would hold, as far as oil discoveries were concerned, some of the deepest and vastest oil discoveries in the world. Well, then there was the Hashemite clan, the Husseins. The British found the former Sharif of Mecca too volatile to work with by the end of the war. Therefore, they started to work with his sons, chiefly Feisal, who we've already talked about, and his other son, Abdullah. Now, Feisal, as you'll recall, he's the guy who fit the romantic picture of an Arab warrior. This was the way T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, that's how he saw him. They fought side by side in the Arab revolt during the war, and Lawrence was firmly committed to Feisal. At the end of the war, an American journalist, Lowell Thomas, he developed a drama about Lawrence and Feisal that secured their fame. As the production toured Europe, it was reported that Lawrence even attended its performance no less than 6 times, and he was pleased with his new celebrity status. At the peace conference itself in 1919, Lawrence was rarely seen without Feisal. He was intent on helping the Arab warrior get what he deserved in the post-war settlement conference. He frequently acted as Feisal's interpreter, even drafted the speeches that Feisal gave to the conference attendees. At one point, as Feisal spoke at the conference in Arabic, Lawrence interpreted in English and in French, and it's rumored that Feisal did no more than quote from the Quran as he spoke, while Lawrence actually presented his desired policies and proposals to the conference. In the end, none of this really mattered. The great powers had no intention of granting Feisal or any of the members of the Hashemite clan the whole of the former Ottoman Empire and its holdings in the Middle East. That's what the Hashemites wanted. The French were determined to take Lebanon. They believed they had a stake there in defense of the Maronite Christian community. The French had gained a foothold in the Lebanon region in the mid-19th century. So in defense of the Maronite Christians and an outburst of persecutions during that time, the French now claimed they had a stake there by the end of World War I. The problem was the definition of Lebanon. The French saw Lebanon as extending all the way to what we know as Syria today. If there were two parts of the Middle East that demonstrated strong and well-developed nationalist sentiment and the desire to rule themselves, it was Egypt and Syria. Egypt was put in the hands of a monarch and oversight from the British. Syria, on the other hand, they didn't have a monarchy like the Egyptians did. It was a land of great diversity. For centuries, the mountainous terrain of Syria had served as a refuge for various minority groups to take shelter in, to develop their own thriving communities. So they truly wanted their own self-rule and independence, and they thought they would get it at World War I. If they had to be ruled over, they wanted to be ruled by an Arab. Feisal had actually helped the British in taking Damascus from the Ottomans during the war. So for Feisal and the Syrians, this seemed like a perfect fit. It wasn't going to be the whole of the Middle East, and if that was the case, then why not give Feisal Syria? Well, the French weren't too interested in Feisal. That was the problem. They had no commitments to him. That was between the British and Feisal, not between the French and Feisal. So in March 1920, the Syrian National Congress proclaimed Feisal as king of the Arab Kingdom of Syria. 1 month later, the British, in accordance with the Sykes-Picot Agreement and its designs, turned over their holdings in the Levant to France. So by July, the new king of Syria was expelled. Feisal was expelled from the country by the French. Well, now the Hashemites are left with nothing. And the most image-friendly face of the Arab revolt to the Western powers was left asking the British where their promised spoils of war were. T.E. Lawrence himself felt like the British had utterly betrayed Feisal, had utterly betrayed his family. So the British encouraged Feisal to be patient. They wouldn't forget him, and in a year's time, they determined that Feisal would be the perfect candidate to be the new king of their mandate in Iraq. Now, the British mandate of Iraq was the epitome of British arrogance and ignorance in the Middle East. To be real frank, the idea of Iraq never existed before World War I. It only made sense in the designs and the schemes of the European powers. Even today, there's debate over what the name of Iraq actually means. Prior to this time, the region was usually referred to as Mesopotamia, or the different Ottoman names during that time. The modern nation of Iraq was created by combining 3 different provinces of the former Ottoman Empire, provinces that had been fairly influential before that time, provinces that really needed to stay separate if they were to function properly. It combined Sunni, Shia, Arab, Kurds. It made no sense. Iraq didn't. It made no sense except in the minds of the great powers of Europe. So after putting down the first of many insurrections in the newly formed Iraq, the British decided that the new mandate of Iraq would be the perfect fit for Feisal, their way of fulfilling their promise to him. The biggest problem of this, of course, was that most of the people in this area of the Middle East had no idea who Feisal was. His family's power, their influence, was located in the West, in Mecca, maybe even in Palestine, not in Baghdad. He was also a Sunni in this Shiite majority contrivance. But the one qualification Feisal fit best of all was that he would need the British behind him to guarantee his hold on power. And thus the British could ensure his loyalty as he became the new leader of Iraq. Thus was born the dysfunctional nation of Iraq, which we will definitely hear more about in later episodes in this series. But all was not complete, of course, with the Hashemites. Following the French takeover of Syria, there was a lack of clarity of who had control over the land known as Transjordan. Was it the British or the French? The land of the Palestine Mandate was supposed to end at the Jordan River. How far south was the new French Syria supposed to go? So after some confusion, the British finally decided that French Syria did not extend into this area that they called Transjordan. Thus, the Transjordan Mandate was established, simply over a border disagreement. And who better to award this new kingdom than to the other son of Hussein, Abdullah? Now, no one would have called it at this time. No one could have predicted this, but Transjordan, the nation that would eventually be known as Jordan today, this would be one of the few kingdoms that endured through the decades since the Middle East was formed at the end of World War I. All the way to this day. It's Abdullah's great-grandson who still rules over Jordan today. His name is King Abdullah II. The descendants of the first king of the new nation of Jordan would become pivotal experts in navigating the conflicts between Israel and the Arab states over the next century. Finally, there was Turkey, the last of the Middle East states formed at the end of World War I. Perhaps no territory of the former Ottoman Empire seemed less likely to last through the war than its capital territory, but that's exactly what happened. A young officer who became known as Ataturk, he proved himself as one of the most competent officers in the Ottoman army during World War I. And as the Allies withdrew to the Peace Conference of Paris in 1919, Ataturk coordinated the power structures of Turkey's nationalists around himself. And soon the greatest threat to Turkish nationalism was the Greek army. Well, many in the West saw yet again a romantic struggle between the Greeks, who they equated with the ancient Greeks or Alexander the Great, and the Turks. President Woodrow Wilson opposed the Turks on the grounds of the genocide that they unleashed against the Armenian Christians there. But Ataturk realized that neither the Americans nor the Europeans were going to send their armies back to Turkey by the end of the peace conference, by this time. And he bet all the power he had into defeating the Greeks. He also paid off the French and the Italian governments to support his claim to Turkish power at the settlement conference that followed Paris. So by 1923, Ataturk had expelled the Greek army as well as the Ottoman Sultan and proclaimed himself as president of the new Turkish state. Now his rule would become one of the most effective in the Middle East. He shunned the old order, leaning in towards Europe, trying to diminish his country's Islamic history. In the coming years, different leaders of the Middle East would actually try to emulate Ataturk in his drive towards modernity, his separation from the historic traditions of the region. And so was born, in the years around 1919, the new modern Middle East. It was a sort of rebudding of the recently disintegrated Ottoman Empire, contrived in the recipes, the formulations that power brokers in Europe needed for their own interests. It was made up of nations that competed against one another for power, and often included people within each of these individual nations' borders that also competed with one another. Historically, when we look back 100 years ago to the decisions made in 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference, it's easy to see that this was never going to work. The formation of the modern Middle East was a recipe for disaster. In many instances, as we'll see, it was a deliberate recipe for disaster. The European powers wanted the rulers, the nations of the Middle East, to always need them. So they established the nations of the Middle East in weakness. In other instances, it was simply an issue of unintended consequences. In many ways, the story of the next 100 years of the Middle East is a tale of unceasing unintended consequences. This was the birthing point, though, the point of formation of the modern Middle East. In our next episode, we'll look at the next pivotal year in the shaping of the modern Middle East, the chaos we know today, and the story of how we got here. In that episode, we're going to look at 1948. It's a story that includes a lot more than what you might assume. So stay tuned. Be on the lookout for that next episode to drop from the end of history in the coming days.
Thanks for listening to The End of History with J.B. Shreve. Check out more episodes at iTunes and wherever you download quality podcasts. Join us online at theendofhistory.net for articles and essays from the end of history. Follow JB on Twitter at JB_Shreve. The End of History is produced by Windmill Media.